Hope well finds message. You finds message. This message. I. Well, you finds you. I hope. Well, hope. Message. This. I. You. This. This. Well finds you. Finds you. Hope. You. This. I. Well.
Hi, welcome to another episode of I Hope This Message Finds You Well. My name is Kris Dittel, and with me is my friend and colleague Eloise Sweetman. Today, we share an excerpt from a longer conversation we did with Jo-ey Tang in April 2021.
Jo-ey Tang is a Hong Kong-born American curator, artist, writer in no hierarchical order. He began working alongside artists at the Notary Public in 2010 in his New York City apartment while a graduate student at New York University. Jo-ey was arts editor of literary journal N+1, curator at Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and director of exhibitions at Beeler Galerie at Columbus College of Art and Design. Most recently, he curated exhibitions at Centre Pompidou in Paris, Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and Futuria Center of Contemporary Art in Prague.
I hope this message finds you well.
Just before we met with Eloise, I asked her, and then I was like, oh, and actually we can ask you, if you consider yourself an artist who curates, or a curator who is also an artist, or an artist who is also a curator, what is the relationship between these two roles and how you see your practice unfolding in this constellation?
When I was working at Palais Tokyo in 2014-15, that was my first time working in an institution. And I was previously part of a sort of citywide project that Palais Tokyo initiated in 2013, which was focusing on this idea of the artist curator. And so there were a constellation of shows at Palais Tokyo, but also in different galleries in Paris. So I curated one of these projects in the gallery at Place de Leonard. And so when I started this position at Palais Tokyo, I still had a practice, a kind of non-studio practice of some sort. I was still showing my work, and I really thought that I would have to stop making art, or mainly because I wouldn't have any time, because my job was very demanding, where I had to do quite a lot of travel and produce a show in 9 months with artists from China specifically. So I have to do the research and then do this show. But it turned out that I had a solo gallery show at the Galerie in Paris, who I worked with, Jo-ey Tang, who we're not related actually, but I can tell you more about that. Maybe I can, this would be the space to really clarify to all the people out there that we're not the same person. We're not brothers, or he's not my dad, or, I think there are other rumors there too. But I really thought that because of the responsibilities at Palais Tokyo I would have, there's no way that I can concentrate on making my own work. But what I found out was that through the many studio visits I was doing that year, I think I did over 100, 20 or more, and I think it was 12, 14 cities or something. Some very short, some hours long. So they were not all very involved, all the same duration in terms of the studio visit time, but that was quite a lot of work. And that experience actually reinforced it gave me a way to insist on my own art practice. One of the fears as an artist curator is, once you're meeting artists and you're working with artists, you or I started I thought I would start to question my own work, both my commitment to my own work, but also, the way that what's my work as an artist. But I think that research, those trips actually showed me that, there is something within my own work that's uniquely mine, let's say, that I was dealing with very kind of concerns that are very specific to my practice. Maybe another way to say it is that I didn't feel like worried about, like, I was worried that it would sort of like absorb what I see, and then like it will kind of, to infiltrate my practice. And then it would be very embarrassing to, the worst thing is to take on someone's ideas, right? Like that's something you saw in the studio, and then now it's like, in your work, that we all kind of hear stories about that, like in schools or, between teachers and students and things like that. But that didn't, like, those fears actually were quickly dissipated because I found that there was something in my work. So I did a solo show at Jo-ey Tang, and I thought actually that was a turning point for me. And I realized that my work was really about the boundaries and the limitations, but also the possibility of time and space, and the limits of an exhibition as a holder of my work. As I was, planning for, at that time, like the biggest kind of, in terms of size and duration of planning, what was the biggest kind of exhibitions I've ever put together as a curator, I was able to actually find my own way of working in my art. So that was really a turning point. So I think, they're friends, let's say, like my art and my curatorial work, but they're not, they can get together, but they're not the same person.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use, like, you were talking about like the limits of time and space of that hold your exhibitions, and it is interesting to think about that in terms of like perhaps I'm going too far in advance, but into like your work with Fierce Pussy, which to me feels also kind of pushing the limits of time and space. And it was interesting to think about that also, because you mention in your biography about thinking along with artists, which to me seems like quite an important part of the way that you curate. And I was wondering if you could talk about like what that means actually, and how that what does that look like actually? These long-term relationships also are important.
I just wanted to find a way to work with artists, I think in general, and trying to find ways to kind of break open some of these limitations that institutions put forth, for many, many reasons that they have to do so. But also I was, specifically with the members of Fierce Pussy, with the artists Nancy Brooks Brody, Carrie Yamaoka, Joy Episalla, and Zoe Leonard. And maybe briefly about that project is that the four of them formed a collective called Fierce Pussy in 1991, as they initially met at an ACT UP meeting through their work in AIDS activism. And ACT UP stands for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And they really wanted, as they were caring for their friends who were dying of AIDS, many of them were men, and they wanted to find a space to connect with other women identified members of ACT UP. And so they formed a group together, and there were other people, founding members as well, but there are different members through the years, but they were the four core people who have been there since the beginning. And the kind of idea, or maybe even the limits for the project, was really to think about their personal practices as individual artists in and alongside the collective work as Fierce Pussy, which involved mostly in the beginning, public works, with pasting of posters that are used to connect with and call out other queer folks in the public space. But I started working with Nancy, Jo-ey, and Carrie on another project that centers around the techniques of photograms in kind of darkroom residency that I co-founded with the artist Thomas Fougeot in the outskirts of Paris. And if you sort of maybe get to know the works of Nancy, Jo-ey, Carrie for the first time, and Zoe, I personally didn't know that they were part of Fierce Pussy. Like, I knew of Fierce Pussy and I knew of them. Like, the work they make are not immediately visually connected, like the individual work and the collective work. And so this was around 2005 when I approached them to think together about ways of bringing their individual practices in conversation, the resonances between their works, the way they think about materials, surfaces, through many different strategies, including abstraction, including a kind of engagement with time through sculpture, photography, video. And I found out that they had never shown their works together as just the four of them, though they've been in many, many group exhibitions that center around AIDS activism or kind of queer aesthetics, etc. So I thought, like, that's such an obvious thing to do then. And because they're decades of, they've been together as a group for a few decades, one exhibition's not gonna, like, an exhibition isn't the form. It might not be the form for bringing them together. At that time, I wasn't thinking about a space specifically. I didn't want the space to determine what we would do. So my proposal to them was just to think together and maybe it's a talk that we will end up having with them, or a book, or a dinner. I didn't want to ask for things that artists usually are being asked to do. Like, I didn't feel like, this idea of performing for the public, they already do so much work for the public. So what would the engagement with the public mean? And also because I've never worked with the four of them, I felt like it's not my place to propose an exhibition. Like, exhibition felt like was the wrong way to go about it. Like, because it's a very specific goal post. And if being in the world, it's about moving around through these sort of goalposts, then we must think in different ways. So I think that learning process of working, of the work of the artist, but also learning how to work together was really important. It continues to be important since the project is still ongoing. And eventually the project became it encompasses exhibitions, and in the process is a book, and then public talks and events and performances, etc. But that was only because I had the opportunity to work as a director of a gallery in an art school. And so that became a kind of like thinking through time about, again, not having a static exhibition, to be able to hold the work that is so dynamic, and it's what being in movement in the world mean. That's one of the kind of like how can an exhibition correspond or communicate or address the ways the artists work, or how these four artists work, which thinks about the idea of time through series making, series that don't feel like a series, series that are done maybe intermittently through decades. Like, how do you address that kind of making?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's more like a comment. I just found it very inspiring, or sort of, I feel this liberation hearing about, being able to take the space and the time despite the kind of requirements of the general like art world working process or institutional kind of day-to-day business, when the registrar has to do their work, the art handler has to do their work, the show is like 2 months or 3 months duration, and then moving on to the next thing. I find it just really inspiring to take that space, which I feel like it's very courageous also to take and claim that space. I had a question about the very beginnings. What led you to, or have you become a curator, or perhaps was it like a natural process, or when have you started naming yourself a curator also?
So the beginning was when I was getting my MFA degree, my master in art as an artist at New York University, around 2009. So 2009, 2010, and then 11. And in the middle of the 2 years in New York, I, with student loans, and this is right after the 2008 financial crash, where I sort of shifted. Like, I decided I was already living in New York, and I decided that I wouldn't want to go back to work. Also, I was working in the magazine industry, which totally collapsed in 2008, 2009. So there were no jobs in the field that I was working in New York. So this is the moment when physical magazines were going through a shift. So things were starting to be just online. And then there was this question of like, if magazines are going to die or something. And so I went back to school, and I actually not sure how much I would share about this part. Like, so it was 2009, 2010. So in the summer between the 2 years, because, like, what do I do? Like, I don't have the resources and money to go somewhere, have student loans. I'm not going to like a vacation or something. So I decided and this is the moment where they were starting. I mean, there are different periods in New York, of course, through the past decades, where the idea of having exhibitions in your home or your apartment, or spaces that are temporary, were becoming a space where artists work out their ideas. And so I thought in that summer I'm going to have a show in my apartment, which was really quite a small space. It was maybe 25 square meter. It was a 25 square meter space on Madison Avenue, which was a space I moved into actually because it was very affordable. I should kind of like maybe clarify that, because it's in the neighborhood. It's in the Upper East Side, the Carnegie Hill neighborhood, which normally it's not so affordable. But this specific building, there was like a kind of deli on the ground floor and a salon on the second floor. So it was actually very affordable, and it was maybe one of the few buildings that didn't have like a concierge or something. Actually, it was like more affordable than some of the other neighborhoods where my friends were living in Brooklyn. And so I thought I would have a show there in that summer. And so I invited classmates, artists I met, and teachers, and people who came through for studio visits from school. So I did that was my first show I curated, and I think I had a work in it too. So this, in the early years, I would be in some of the projects that I curate, usually as a way to kind of be with the artist. So, not like, oh, I'm a curator, but like I'm just putting a show together. Maybe that's kind of a better way of thinking about what I do. It's just putting artworks alongside each other. And yeah, so that was a really kind of critical moment. One thing that I did do was I wanted the exhibition to have two parts. So what's different about the second part is that some artworks would be moved, but their movements were very minor. And I was very much, I still think about this film by the Thai filmmaker Apichatpong Veerasamthiku, his film Blissfully Yours, which essentially I was thinking a lot about this moment when the film starts. The film actually starts, well, there's the beginning of the film, and then there's the kind of credits, the beginning credits of the film that starts maybe like 20 minutes into the film. So there's this kind of shift of consciousness that takes place, like, oh, now it really starts, but then does that mean what you just saw was the end? Like, there was this very conscious, it was longer than usual when, typical when the movie really starts. So, and at that moment, I thought I was at the middle of the film, but I don't think it was right in the middle, but it felt like that, like it really split something that could loop back. The end could look back into the beginning. So my idea for my apartment, which was I called it the Notary Public as a way to think about the function of the notary in the US, which is very different. Like you can go to like a shop that sells paper or something. There'll be the notary there and just like give you the stamp, and they don't even look at. I think I had to get something stamped at that time, and they don't even look at your papers. They just stamp it. It doesn't have the same status as perhaps in France, the role of the notary. And so the idea was to split the exhibition in halves. And the second half, there was a diptych by an artist, Cody Trapte. One work was slightly smaller than the other one. They look quite identical. I just kind of swapped the two. There was a configuration of works about the sofa, which were just moved, rehung. There was one work by Heidi Hinrichs, which was a sculpture that was resting on a bookshelf, and then in the second half, it kind of like performs and dangles above the desk. So these small shifts that were taking place. There was a work by Carrie, who was one of my teachers, where she made these cast of peanut shells and peanuts. So she gave me like a bunch of them, and I asked if I could just, do this process of accumulation that like every week or something, there'd be more peanuts and shells on the mantle. So I think some of these ideas kind of come back now, like in a bigger, more expanded way. The idea of accumulation, the idea of change, the idea of imperceptible shifts, the idea of moving an artwork from one place to another, which I should say for the project with Fierce Pussy, some of the artworks they would move into a different room in a different chapter, and artworks would leave and new works would come in. So it's this sort of this constant refreshing of the core of what is visible in the exhibition.
It's also interesting then, so the project, I think it's called More Than Lovers, More Than Friends, the film endings. Is interesting then also in what you were saying about Apichatpong Veerasamthiku and also the last page of this book. Would you see? Yeah, it's also really, so it's or maybe Jo-ey, you want to explain the project, because This to me would be a really interesting example of when something that could be both an artwork and a curated project, actually. I don't know which you see it as.
Yeah, no, that's very true. This is an interesting instance. So the project was actually first installed at Futura in Prague. It was a series of film endings that I asked. Maybe I think there were like 40, 50 people about their favorite film endings. Being, someone who loves watching films, staying till the end, always. I only watch films in cinemas. It's just a space I can actually not be distracted. And that sort of shift of consciousness that happens at that song that they played when the credits roll that has like nothing to do sometimes with the film. Like it's a different energy. It's a different mode of being. Sometimes it's a song that maybe it's like a pop song that like seems really incongruent with the film. I've always been interested in this moment. Like when, I mean, most of the people have left already. And then the song that seems to like, not really doing much to the experience of the film because by then you're all, leaving the cinema or turned it off already. But that somehow pushed one either back into reality or it actually complicates the reality that you like re-enter, leaving the cinema. In one particular and sometimes it happens like in the last scene and it's the song that carries out. So in Claire Denise's film, both Tavai, the Bach song, Rhythm of the Night is this song that, it's one of my favorite scenes of film endings, which is this, like the character, the protagonist kind of breaks into a dance with the song in the room full of mirrors. And so I was really curious if other people have their own, ending. And I think this was in 2016. So actually my father passed away that year. So I was thinking about ending in different ways. And maybe one interesting thing that I'm still thinking about, and this isn't a question that you're asking about, like the difference between kind of the parameters of being an artist and a curator, but I also think about the parameters of living a life and being a curator too. Like, in retrospect, whether, it's something that, I was able to do. Like, I was like preparing for an exhibition while, I was caring for my father and the aftermath of his death. So like, I'm still questioning these things actually now, whether it's like, how do those things intersect? Right. So I think the ending really came out of this, like thinking about other endings that could like lift and push something into a different zone, but also having other people be part of that.
I hope this message finds you well.
But I want to read something that I wrote for a book called Shelf Documents, Art Library as Practice, that was a part of a project with Heide Hinrichs. And it's just an essay where I kind of think about institutions from the vantage point of being in one recently. And this sort of loops back to the way I work with the artists from Fierce Pussy as well, in thinking about this idea of the slowness as a way of working, which I was calling it slow programming, just for it to be understood beyond the curatorial context, as a way to kind of think about, like, insist on a space of working that hopefully suits the artist as well as the people who work with artists. And it kind of touches on some of the maybe questions I have as well. Maybe there's something in there you can answer or respond to. It's just one paragraph. Working with and alongside artists in an embodied entanglement, adjacencies, proximities, and contingencies are set into motion, sustained by an ethos I termed slow programming. Its name is a dig at the pervasiveness in the co-opting of curation. Slow programming co-opts the infusion of the slow food movement in aspects of contemporary life. Slow programming is active and is held together through collective labor embodies over time. Slow programming motivates attentiveness and brings the transformation of awareness into view. Slow programming occupies the time and space in between as well as what it envelops. Slow programming reorders how time is used and felt. As artists, their works and their publics move through the physical space of the gallery and beyond its confines. Slow programming advocates for a flexibility around rigid administration, bureaucracy, budgetary allocation, and fiscal projections to take into account how artists work and live in the world. Slow programming acknowledges that institutional memories are developed by people and might be short-lived. Slow programming reshapes infrastructure to participate in a collective past, present, and future, where staff, adjuncts, and tenured professors, students, and publics live out histories. Slow programming embraces the volatile instability of institutions as one that is already found in the world, and as such animates pliability to construct with artists in their temporary residence in institutional structures. Slow programming tends to and cares for. Slow programming enlivens contradictions. Slow programming reckons with the capitalist amassing of student debt and teacher debt.
Nice.
Thank you.
I like this idea of slow programming also that allows hesitation and pause. And could you read the line again about the contradiction, actually? Because I think that is something that one gets caught up with.
Well, it's quite short, actually, that part. Slow programming tends to and cares for. Slow programming enlivens contradictions. Slow programming reckons with the capitalist amassing of student debt and teacher debt. So what I found is that, a lot of the teachers in the US actually are paying off their student loans and their salaries can't pay for, their student loans. And so there's this contradiction there as well, where you as a maybe adjunct professor or teacher are, experiencing some of the aftermath of being a student. So then there's this sort of space of, contradiction there. And that's really something it was actually really it is hard to be in that space, hard to work in this space as someone who is still paying off my student loans, where, I think that in itself, the structural problem in the US and also the inequity that arises out of that as well.
I was just going to mention it very much speaks to what I aspire to. My aspiration is to be more patient, especially with myself, also within my work, which I feel I'm getting very much caught on in this very quick modus operandi, quick decisions, moving on to the next thing, which is also this kind of constant anxiety survival mode of having to produce something just to be able to live. But that's kind of a very tricky thing to be in. But the contradictions of slow programming also is to go very slow. You have to work really, really hard to, control, but also to resist the kind of outside demands and expectations and responsibilities too. So it was also really important, I think, or interesting to talk about those contradictions or how to tackle them.
It's also interesting to think about the work that you made with the guitar strings, actually, and thinking about slow programming as the audience, or it's sort of an interesting idea that the audience bumps up against something that's seemingly invisible and then has to slow down and negotiate around it. And how it's really interesting to think about how through the routing of an exhibition, you can slow down, sort of slow down a body, and then and then through that a sort of a contemplation, and then so how could you then apply that to an organization or an institution or like a set of operations that allows for the exhibition to come about. Like it's, I don't know if you see a connection, but it's, to me, like it's feels very, very much there.
Well, there's also, I think it's, thinking about at this particular moment, which has been, I guess, 10 years since the first show at my apartment, thinking about these, it's in a way really split between half like what you might call independent curator, though most of it was really, I think, putting things together, and half as part of an institution in different countries. Now I feel like I'm in this really third phase, and it's a kind of interesting time to talk to you because how to proceed in a way, like maybe now I'm more like an interdependent curator. I'm also, questioning the viability of many things, particularly, in the context of the US, you almost feel like you have to do something else in conjunction. So where, this idea of the interdependency or codependency coming into play, but you picking up on the slowness isn't, interesting for me, thinking about the labor in slowness. I think there is a contradiction there as well, that maybe an impression that slowness is invisible, like the labor is invisible in the slowness, which is kind of interesting because you're actually seeing more change, but somehow change feels like it could read as like, no labor required because of the word, the idea of slow somehow. Whereas in fact, it's, maybe something I want to think about. It's, could there be too much slowness where you actually think you are capable of doing more because you're doing less? So then you have like a lot, would I be doing too much of different things that require a slowness? Am I also needing to think about that moving forward? And then also, what is the kind of metabolism of like working as well? Like once you get used to a kind of slowness, do you take on more when you're supposed to not take on more? Like the idea of not taking on more is sort of like absorbed. Yeah. And then this kind of ties back to the idea of productivity and this kind of like, how productive am I?
Actually, I was listening to this podcast on change. I can't exactly remember the title precisely, but it was talking about, I think they call it a generative void. How we need to, I feel like it really is also talking to what you're saying, Joy, and I think that actually we all relate to it in some way, that we need this space to allow for things to bubble up over time. So like, I guess it's also connected to allowing yourself to be bored or to be restless, and being in that space for then these creative connections to come out, rather than having to force like, brilliant ideas, like pumping them out like where they're, something in a factory. And this woman was saying that so much in our life doesn't allow for this generative void. Also, it's scary to be in this space of like hesitation or pause, and the pandemic is kind of also gave many people this chance to recalibrate. So some people do thrive in the pandemic situation, like Kris, in the sense of being able to slow down and decide what is important.
Not anymore, though.
But
the first few months of the pandemic, but I think it's kind of like...
But maybe that's because you also had a lot of good ideas in that time.
Yeah, I mean, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's somehow this is my own working, but definitely I felt like the first few months of the pandemic when everything stopped and it was okay not to answer emails for weeks on. I actually had a time of my life in terms of like thinking about what I want to do and how I want to do things. And so like a lot of those kind of seeds are potentially planted already or kind of happening, or even our podcasts sort of came out of these kind of discussions and also necessity or kind of a need to talk about art and our practice with others. So yeah.
No, but I think being able to like, how can an organization or how can we as freelance curators or independent curators also like kind of program into our work this slowness that in some ways like it might be easier to do it if you're an institution because it could be like sort of, you know, how is it in organic farming? You have to leave a field untended to for a certain amount of time for it to regenerate. Like perhaps an organization can think about themselves in a similar way that like every 12 months there's like a 2-month stopping of practice and seeing what regenerates. But as freelancers, I don't know if we can necessarily do that, or we may have to insist in the way that we go like design our contracts, or how we decide to take on projects that we go, okay, like I have got 7 projects, you know, after they're all done, I will take 6 months off, which is also a luxury somehow.
Yeah. I mean, how to afford that even, you know, it's like sort of at the end, it also breaks down to that, and also breaks down to the fact that the art world tends to operate in a way that once you disappear for a longer period of time, you are kind of discredited by default.
I think the resource sharing with, you know, the transparency that, you know, that it's gaining support across the kind of institutional roles, like in terms of salary transparency. In the US, there was, you know, this giant Google Doc spreadsheet that some people share, but also the other parts is transparency for like as independent, like curators, like, you know, how much do you ask for? What's fair? What did other people get? And, you know, those things I think still are so hard to come by. And then it's almost, I think that's the next, you know, hopefully there's a space for that sharing to take place so that one can, you know, like not plan in a way that isn't realistic or ended up, just to have that information prepared. Like, I think even for people who are starting out and then be like, oh, this publication pays this much for this how many words. So, you know, yes, do that. And then what do you aim for and how many can you do? And, you know, just to be kind of realistic about that, you know.
Yeah, also like with this idea of being transparent and resource sharing, we were just earlier talking about curatorial collectives or collective working, and we propose perhaps that's one way of accruing time, you know, so that projects can still be maintained and that, or like, you know, new projects can happen whilst somebody can step back and, you know, take the time that they need. But also it leads me from what we are now talking about to think about what in our previous interview with Lara, she was talking about how for her right now in Documenta, they have many different working groups. I don't know how many people are working there in total, but there are a certain amount of people per working group that allows for you know, if you need to care for somebody, whether a child or otherwise, you can take the time to step away or bring them into the process, or, you know, however. And it is interesting, like, rather than maybe necessarily creating, you know, a global collective of curators, but the fact that we can think that perhaps we can start through perhaps the podcast or through deprofessionalize or removing this veneer, being like perhaps asking somebody to step in for you whilst you take the time. Like, it never occurred to me that I could do that, actually, you know. Like, it's interesting idea, actually, and through that you are then perhaps creating other opportunities for people that may not be able to get them. It would also remove a certain kind of stockpiling or opportunity hoarding, which happens. Also, fresh ideas would come out. It's an interesting idea. How can we make that happen? Yeah, I think perhaps it's a good note to end on. We've really covered a lot. And
well, there is one question here that maybe I can answer to end it, which is, if you weren't a curator, what would you do? I actually would love to be, and maybe this, you know, definitely should be kept on the podcast so people can maybe ask me to do it. I'd love to be a still photographer on a film. Like, that's, like, I, you know, love film, but how I want to engage with film would be, you know, that, like, but I think that the stills would not be very quote unquote representative of the film in a kind of direct way. So, but maybe I should just look for that opportunity to get on film sets.
Fingers crossed, someone.
yeah.
Job wanted.
Yeah.
Job
wanted. All right. Well, thanks so much, Jo-ey.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks so much for your time.
I hope this message finds you well.
If you would like to know more about Jo-ey's work, we recommend reading his piece on slow programming titled Finding the Core, Our Institutions, Ourselves, published in Shelf Documents, Art Library as Practice, co-edited by Jo-ey with Heide Hinrichs and Elizabeth Haynes.
In the next episode, we interview Claire Butcher, educator and arts practitioner who has recently returned to the title of curator as way of positioning her practice. We discuss the difference between curating and arts education in larger scale events, and also the urgencies of art education for the future of art and curatorial practice.
If you have feedback, you can email us at ihopethismessagefindsyouwell@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at ihopethismessage and find us on SoundCloud under the same handle. Our jingle was by the band Difficult, and sound engineering was done by Nick Thomas.
Hope well finds message. You finds message. This message. I well you finds you. I hope. Well hope. Message this. I you this. Well finds you. Finds you hope. You this I. Well. Hope well finds message. You finds message. This message. I. Well you finds you. I hope. Well hope. Message this. I you this.